Picture this. A fisherman is out on a quiet stretch of water, minding his own business, when a wild dolphin suddenly appears next to his boat, nudging something toward him. He leans over expecting maybe a fish, maybe trash, maybe nothing at all. Instead, it's a baby dolphin, tangled in fishing line, barely breathing. The mother is right there, circling, watching, somehow understanding that this particular ape in this particular floating object might be able to help in a way she physically cannot. This isn't some isolated feel-good viral fluke either. This exact pattern, animals bringing their most vulnerable, most precious offspring directly to humans, shows up again and again across completely unrelated species on every continent, in situations that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And once you start pulling at that thread, the explanation gets a lot more interesting than animals just like us. Let's start with the obvious question, the one you're probably already asking. Why would any wild animal, a creature whose entire evolutionary programming is built around fear, suspicion, and self-preservation, voluntarily walk up to the single most dangerous species on the planet and hand over its baby? Humans have spent the last 10,000 years hunting, displacing, and occasionally domesticating basically every animal we've come into contact with. By every reasonable evolutionary metric, animals should treat us the way you'd treat a stranger holding a chainsaw at 2 a.m. And yet, over and over, across species that share almost nothing in common biologically, we see the exact opposite. We see trust. Specifically, trust at the moment it matters most when a life is on the line. So let's actually dig into this, because the answer isn't one single tidy explanation. It's a stack of overlapping reasons, and honestly, by the end of this, you might start side-eyeing your pets a little differently. First, let's talk about the cat thing, because if you own a cat, you might have already experienced this firsthand and not even realized what was happening. Outdoor cats and feral cat colonies have a long, well-documented history of bringing kittens, sometimes injured, sometimes just newborn and helpless, directly to specific humans they've identified as reliable. Not random humans. Specific ones. The neighbor who leaves food out, the person who once helped a stray with a thorn in its paw 3 months ago, and was apparently never forgiven for it, because now there's a steady stream of kittens showing up on the porch like some kind of furry subscription service nobody signed up for. Cats are incredibly good at building what researchers sometimes call a mental map of safe versus unsafe entities in their environment. They watch, they remember, they notice which humans are calm, predictable, and food-providing, versus which humans are loud, erratic, or prone to chasing them off with a broom. Once a cat builds enough trust in a particular human, that human essentially gets reclassified, mentally, from potential threat to something closer to extension of the colony. And once you're inside that mental category, you start getting access to the same protective instincts a mother cat would extend to another trusted adult cat. The kittens get brought to you not because the cat thinks you're magic, but because you've already passed a months-long, completely unspoken background check. Now here's where it gets stranger, because this same pattern of test, evaluate, trust, then deploy the babies shows up in animals that are nowhere near as domesticated as your average backyard cat colony. Dolphins and whales have an extensive, well-documented history of approaching boats specifically when an injured calf or an entangled juvenile is involved. There's something almost eerie about how deliberate this behavior looks. These aren't panicked, random encounters. Researchers and fishermen have reported cases where a mother whale will position an injured calf directly alongside a boat, hold position, and wait, almost like she's saying, "All right, your turn. Do the thing you do." Marine biologists have pointed to cetacean intelligence and social complexity as a likely explanation here. Dolphins and whales already operate within incredibly tight-knit pods that practice cooperative care, shared babysitting duties, and coordinated rescue behavior among their own kind. If you already have the cognitive and social wiring to recognize this individual needs help, and that other individual over there has the ability to provide it, it's apparently not that big a leap to occasionally extend that recognition across species lines, especially toward a species that's been floating around in slow, loud, clearly non-threatening boats for generations. There's also a sneaky little detail that gets overlooked here. Human boats are loud, but human distress responses are remarkably consistent and remarkably gentle when an animal is visibly injured or in trouble. Slow movements, quiet voices, careful hands. Animals are extremely good at reading body language, and a species that consistently responds to vulnerability with gentleness instead of aggression eventually gets filed under a different category entirely. We're loud and we're everywhere, sure, but we're also, weirdly, one of the only species on the planet that regularly goes out of its way to help baby animals that aren't even our own. That reputation apparently travels. Let's talk about birds for a second, because bird behavior around humans gets wildly underrated in this whole conversation. There are well-documented cases of wild birds, magpies, crows, even certain raptors bringing injured or abandoned chicks towards specific humans who've previously shown some kind of caretaking behavior, feeding the local flock, rescuing a chick that fell from a nest, that sort of thing. Crows in particular are famous for this, mostly because crows have memory systems that would honestly embarrass some humans. Crows can recognize individual human faces for years, hold what looks suspiciously like a grudge against people who've wronged them, and extend something that looks a whole lot like loyalty toward people who've helped them. If a crow decides you're one of the good ones, that designation can apparently last basically forever, passed down even to the crow's own offspring, who somehow seem to know which humans are fine, before ever directly interacting with them. This raises a genuinely fascinating possibility that some of this baby-delivering behavior isn't just individual trust, it's something closer to inherited or socially transmitted trust. A young animal raised around a parent who treats a particular human as safe may simply absorb that assessment the same way a human kid absorbs which neighbors are the nice ones, without ever being explicitly told. Now, here's a big one that ties a lot of this together. Domestication didn't just change animals physically, it fundamentally rewired how certain species process trust and dependency in the first place. Dogs are the most obvious example here. And dog behavior around bringing puppies to humans is honestly one of the most touching things in the entire animal kingdom. A mother dog who trusts her owner will frequently bring newborn puppies directly to that person, sometimes literally carrying them one by one and depositing them at the human's feet like she's making a delivery. This isn't random. Domesticated dogs have spent roughly 15,000 years evolving alongside humans specifically around cooperative care, shared resources, and mutual protection. Somewhere deep in dog psychology, humans got permanently filed under pack member with thumbs, and pack members get access to the puppies. It's not a fluke. It's the entire point of how the relationship evolved in the first place. And this is where the story gets a little bit deeper, because that same wiring, the stuff that makes a dog trust a human enough to hand over puppies, seems to occasionally bleed outward into wild populations too. There have been documented cases of wild wolves, coyotes, and even foxes showing unusually low fear behavior around specific humans in areas with long histories of indirect coexistence, feeding stations, low hunting pressure, generations of non-threatening encounters. It's not domestication exactly, but it's something adjacent to it. A kind of soft, slow-building familiarity that occasionally produces behavior you'd normally only expect from a fully domesticated animal. Let's get into elephants for a second, because elephant behavior around humans might be the single most emotionally devastating example in this entire topic. And I say that with full awareness that I'm explaining all this with a slightly goofy tone. Elephants have an enormous memory, famously enormous, and they form deep, multi-generational social bonds within their herds. There are numerous documented cases of elephant herds approaching specific humans, often conservationists, rangers, or sanctuary workers with injured or orphaned calves, almost like they're requesting medical intervention. In several well-documented sanctuary situations, elephant mothers have been observed essentially presenting an injured calf to caretakers, standing back and waiting, sometimes for hours, clearly anticipating some kind of help. What makes this especially wild is that elephants appear to remember specific individual humans who've helped them or their herd members in the past, sometimes for years, sometimes for the animal's entire lifetime. There are stories of elephants recognizing former caretakers after a decade of separation, responding with behavior that looks an awful lot like genuine emotional recognition. If an elephant can hold onto a positive memory of a specific human for 10+ years, it's honestly not that surprising that the same elephant would eventually decide that human is a safe option when a calf needs help. So at this point, you might be noticing a pattern building here. And it's worth naming directly. Nearly every example we've covered involves animals with unusually strong memory, social complexity, and some history, even an indirect one, of low-threat interaction with humans. This isn't random animal behavior. It's closer to a slow-building, cross-species trust algorithm built case by case, generation by generation, memory by memory. There's also a less romantic, more practical layer to all of this, and it's worth talking about honestly instead of just leaning into the warm, fuzzy version. Sometimes bringing a baby to a human isn't really a deliberate, thoughtful gesture of trust. Sometimes it's closer to desperation. A mother animal facing a predator threat, a flooding den, an injury she physically cannot treat, may simply be drawn toward the nearest large, slow-moving, generally non-predatory shape in the area, which, awkwardly, often ends up being us. Humans are big, loud, and tend to smell like campfires, sunscreen, and questionable fast food decisions, none of which scream, "I am a threat to your baby," in the same way a genuine predator's scent would. In a moment of crisis, an animal's options narrow fast, and sometimes the trust the human option isn't really trust at all. It's the absence of a worse alternative. But here's the thing. Even desperation-based trust still requires the animal's brain to make a calculated risk assessment that we, historically, don't deserve. The fact that approach the human consistently beats out do literally anything else in moments of crisis still says something genuinely remarkable about how animals have recalibrated their threat models around us over time. We've apparently, despite our extremely mixed track record, ended up coded as a viable emergency option across an enormous range of unrelated species. That's not nothing. There's also a fascinating angle involving scent and chemical signaling that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Humans produce a very specific, very recognizable chemical signature, somewhere between the smell of soap, sweat, food residue, and whatever laundry detergent happens to be popular that decade. Animals with strong scent-based memory, and that's most mammals, can apparently catalog specific human scent profiles the same way they'd catalog the scent of a known, safe member of their own group. Once a human's specific scent gets filed under safe, predictable, non-threatening, it can apparently stick around in an animal's memory for an absurdly long time, which helps explain why some of these baby-delivering moments happen with animals that have only had a handful of prior interactions with the human in question. Now let's talk about something that ties this whole topic together in a way most people never consider. Humans are weirdly, almost suspiciously good at recognizing and responding to distress signals from completely unrelated species. There's actual research suggesting that the specific pitch, urgency, and rhythm of distress calls across many mammal species share enough structural similarity that humans instinctively respond to them, even when we've never heard that particular animal's call before. A crying human baby and a distressed puppy trigger remarkably similar instinctive responses in adult humans: faster heart rate, immediate attention, an urge to investigate and help. Some researchers think this instinctive sensitivity to vulnerability might not be limited to recognizing our own species' babies. It might be a broader, somewhat leaky caretaking instinct that occasionally triggers for other species' young as well. If animals have, over generations, picked up on the fact that humans consistently respond to distress signals with help rather than aggression, that reputation becomes an evolutionary asset worth exploiting even across species lines. And honestly, this might be the most important piece of the entire puzzle. We're one of remarkably few species on the planet that regularly, voluntarily, and repeatedly intervenes to help offspring that aren't our own and aren't even our own species. Most predators in nature view another species' vulnerable young as, well, lunch. Humans, despite an admittedly rocky overall relationship with the natural world, have built up a surprisingly consistent reputation across multiple unrelated animal groups as the one species that tends to choose help over harm when a baby animal is in distress. That reputation, built slowly, inconsistently, imperfectly across thousands of individual interactions, seems to be exactly what's driving so much of this behavior. Let's talk about primates for a moment, because this is where things get almost uncomfortably close to home. There are documented cases of wild and semi-wild primates, chimpanzees, bonobos, even certain monkey species in areas with long-term research stations bringing injured or orphaned infants directly toward familiar human researchers. This isn't entirely surprising once you consider how closely primate social cognition mirrors our own. Primates already practice something researchers call alloparenting, where infants are cared for not just by their biological mother but by a wider network of trusted group members, aunts, older siblings, sometimes even unrelated adults who've proven themselves reliable. Extending that same alloparenting logic toward a long-term, consistently non-threatening human observer isn't actually that big a cognitive leap. If a chimpanzee troop has spent years watching a particular researcher behave calmly, predictably, and helpfully, that researcher essentially gets absorbed into the troop's mental map of acceptable infant-adjacent adults, which is a wildly specific category to earn membership in, but apparently achievable with enough patience and zero sudden movements. There's an entire branch of research dedicated to something called the human as safe haven hypothesis. And while that name sounds like it belongs in a fairly dry academic journal, the actual idea behind it is genuinely fascinating. The theory suggests that across multiple independently evolved social species, individual animals can form what's essentially an attachment-style relationship with specific humans. Similar in structure, though obviously not in depth, to the attachment bond between a human infant and a caregiver. Animals that form this kind of bond don't just tolerate the human in question, they actively seek them out during moments of stress, the exact same way a frightened toddler runs toward a parent instead of away from danger in a random direction. If a wild animal has formed even a rough version of that bond with a specific human, bringing a vulnerable baby toward that person during a crisis stops looking strange at all. It starts looking like exactly what you'd expect from any creature seeking out its version of a safe haven. It's also worth mentioning just how consistently this pattern shows up specifically around moments of medical necessity rather than just casual social bonding. Animals don't typically bring their babies to humans to hang out or socialize. They bring them when something is clearly, visibly wrong. An injury, an entanglement, a respiratory problem, a wound that needs cleaning. This detail matters because it suggests these animals aren't just comfortable around humans in a general sense. They're making something that looks suspiciously like a triage decision. They've identified a problem beyond their own capability to fix, and they've identified a specific entity in their environment that has, in the past, demonstrated some ability to fix exactly that kind of problem. That's not blind trust. That's something closer to outsourcing a task to a specialist, which is a frankly impressive cognitive maneuver for an animal that, biologically speaking, has every evolutionary reason to keep predators and strangers as far away from its vulnerable offspring as physically possible. It's worth pointing out that this trust isn't universal, and it's definitely not unconditional. Animals that have had consistently negative experiences with humans, hunted populations, heavily persecuted species, animals living in areas with high human conflict show none of this behavior. The baby delivering pattern shows up almost exclusively in populations with either a long history of low conflict coexistence, individual positive past experiences, or species with unusually strong memory and social cognition that allow them to make nuanced, case-by-case judgments about specific humans rather than judging our species as a whole. In other words, animals aren't trusting humanity in general. They're trusting you, specifically the one who left food out, who moved slowly and quietly during a previous encounter, who didn't scream and run the last time something wild and unexpected showed up nearby. There's also something worth mentioning about how this behavior gets reinforced over time, almost like a feedback loop. A human responds well to one distressed situation. The animal or its social group remembers that. Future generations within that group inherit a slightly lower baseline fear response toward humans in general, or toward that specific human in particular. And the cycle continues, slowly building toward exactly the kind of behavior we're talking about. It's not magic. It's not animals secretly knowing we're good in some grand cosmic sense. It's small, accumulated, repeated evidence, building case by case until a wild animal eventually looks at a human and concludes, yeah, this one's probably fine. Hand over the baby. So why do animals bring babies to humans? Not because we deserve some kind of universal trust from the animal kingdom. Our track record is honestly far too messy for that. It's because across an enormous range of species, in an enormous range of situations, individual animals have built individual case files on individual humans, and some of us, enough of us, apparently keep passing the test. Every slow, careful approach to an injured animal, every bowl of food left out for a stray, every gentle, quiet response to something wild and frightened becomes a tiny data point in an evolutionary ledger we don't even know we're contributing to. And every once in a while, when the stakes are highest, when a baby's life is on the line and a desperate parent is scanning the environment for literally any option that isn't certain death, that ledger gets cashed in, and a human ends up holding a kitten, a calf, a chick, or a baby dolphin, wondering how on earth they ended up being the chosen one. Turns out, we didn't get chosen randomly at all. We got chosen because somewhere along the way, despite everything, we earned it. There's one last layer to this that almost never makes it into the conversation, and it might actually be the most quietly profound part of the entire thing. This behavior changes us too. Every documented case of an animal trusting a human enough to hand over its most vulnerable offspring tends to have a ripple effect on the human involved, and often on entire communities around them. Rangers who've experienced this firsthand frequently describe it as one of the most meaningful moments of their careers, a kind of confirmation that the slow, often thankless work of building trust with wild populations actually means something on the other end. Conservation programs have started actively studying these trust-based interactions, not just as cute anecdotes, but as legitimate indicators of ecosystem health and human-wildlife relationship quality in a given area. A wild population willing to approach humans during a crisis is often a population living somewhere with lower hunting pressure, lower habitat conflict, and a longer track record of coexistence rather than competition. In a strange way, these baby-delivering moments end up functioning as a kind of informal report card on how well humans in a given region have been behaving toward the local wildlife. And maybe that's the most useful way to think about this whole phenomenon. It's not really a story about animals being unexpectedly sentimental or magically trusting of humanity. It's a story about consequences, about every quiet, patient, non-threatening interaction slowly accumulating into something that eventually gets tested at the worst possible moment, when a parent has nowhere else to turn and a baby's life is hanging in the balance. Every single time that test gets passed, it reinforces something fragile and valuable that took generations to build, and could probably be undone in an afternoon of carelessness. So the next time you hear about a dolphin nudging an injured calf toward a boat, or a stray cat parading kittens onto someone's porch, or an elephant herd standing patiently beside a calf waiting for help, don't just file it away as a wholesome animal video. File it away as proof that every once in a while, across an entire planet full of species that have every reason to fear us, we've somehow managed to convince a few of them that we're worth the risk.